Charlotte Sometimes by Penelope Farmer, Chapter 12. At the first sound of footsteps, Charlotte had flung herself into the only hiding place she could see, the small space between the big white cupboard and the end of the wall. Since she and Emily had left, a chest of drawers had been moved in just behind the door. This helped to shelter her. She crouched right down, as did the shadow of the door, which Nurse Gregory had left open, lightening a little the rest of the room, but dimming the corner more. For the moment, Nurse Gregory's back was turned. She was briskly telling her patient to sit up, and after that, Charlotte heard a kind of spluttering, as if the girl had not expected medicine to reach her mouth so fast. Terror made Charlotte feel remote, like an audience at a play or film. Crouched right down, she could not see much that was happening in the area of light, but she could see the shadows bumping and jumbling on the ceiling. Nurse Gregory's shadow was elongated, huge, stretching right across the room. The shadow that her arms made rose and fell from the larger one like claws or branches. Suddenly, Nurse Gregory turned away and advanced toward the door. For one horrible moment, she paused again. Charlotte wanted to leap up, jump out, and explain herself at once before being dragged forth ignominiously. It was only the knowledge that she could not explain anything convincingly that prevented her. In any case, Nurse Gregory merely tucked in a trailing blanket and moved on, with an intolerable loud rustle and hammer blows of feet, until at last, still loudly, she closed the door behind her. In other beds, figures began to stir. The girl in the bed with the wheels shook her head from side to side and cried, "No, no!" As if too late to Nurse Gregory, Charlotte moved her feet, which had been cramped unbearably to find them, riddled at once with pins and needles. After a while, she stood up. She was trembling all over. She did not know how she would dare leave the room again, let alone the school. She strained her ears, thinking all the time that she heard the sound of Nurse Gregory's feet, but she heard only the stirrings in the room. She grabbed enough courage at last to make what seemed the most difficult move in all her life and crept to the door, opening the smallest crack. She saw nothing, heard no sound. Hesitating still, she glanced back to the room to see eyes open suddenly in the nearest bed, and a face look at her in astonishment, the face of Bunty's friend Ruth. Charlotte ran then, not even shutting the door behind her, out into the empty passages, plunging a moment later into the black darkness of the stairhead. She did not even look back to see if anyone was coming. Her heart felt like a rod in a machine, going strong and hard, thump, thump, thump. How she got downstairs and out of the window she could afterwards scarcely remember. She found Emily indignant and seemingly a little disappointed at seeing her. "You were ages," she said. "I'm as cold as ice. I was jolly nearly going home. I thought you must have got into the bed. You were ages and ages." "Was I?" said Charlotte, astonished. "It didn't seem like any time to me." When they looked back after climbing the school gates, the moon was already much lower, but two brilliant tubes of light swung about the sky, advancing, crossing each other like a dance. "Searchlights," said Emily. To catch airplanes, you know. Gosh, I suppose there's an air raid now. That would finish us, wouldn't it?" But she sounded quite happy about it. Charlotte was too dazed to care. She must have been mad to do what she had just been doing. It seemed impossible, an uncomfortable dream. On Monday, when they went back to school again, there were still footmarks up the wall of the day girls' cloakroom. No one seemed to notice them except Charlotte and Emily. But then, no one else would have expected to find them there. The day after the expedition, Emily had been morose, silent. Charlotte, exhausted, thought that probably she was just tired too. But today, though, she was normal again and cheerful, not morose at all. She had not mentioned their failure the whole weekend. Nor did she mention it now. In 1918, Claire had always been a kind of skin about her, Charlotte thought, containing what she did and said and was. The skin thickened imperceptibly the longer she stayed in the past. After their expedition, it began to thicken more rapidly than ever, pressing that part of her which still thought of herself as Charlotte tighter and smaller until it lay deep down in her like a small stone in a large plum. One day, recognizing a certain picture on the walls of Miss Bite's room, of two women in flowing robes and with faces smooth as angels, she could not think at all where she had seen it before or when, in the present or in the past. When her memory struggled to disentangle its two lives, she caught herself wondering if it was something to do with Aunt Dolly's house, then remembered immediately and with a shock that she had never been to Aunt Dolly's house or seen Aunt Dolly. I'm going to have 6 children when I grow up, said Bunty that day in respect to nothing very much. How many are you going to have, Emily? How many are you going to have, Elsie Brand? Emily said nothing. Elsie merely grunted. I expect Emily will have 10, won't she? I expect Elsie will have 10, won't you, Elsie? Cried someone else. And they'll all eat sausage and be called things like Fritz and Gretel. Everyone giggled, except for Charlotte, who cried indignantly but hopelessly, Don't be so horrid! They'll have ordinary names like John and Susan, won't they, Elsie? But Elsie did not reply. She looked blankly, dully at Charlotte and the rest. How many children will you have, Emily? Asked Bunty once again. I'm not going to have any children. Aren't you going to get married, then? Oh, yes, I might get married, but I shan't have children all the same. Emily, why ever not? The voice sounded almost shocked. Everyone has children when they get married. Not everyone does, and I won't. But why ever not? Because it's so awful for them. I mean, it would be if I died and they had nowhere to live, and they had to go around and stay with all sorts of people who didn't want to have them. Why? Said Bunty, quite gently for her. Why, Emily, is that what happens to you and Claire? Emily did not reply. Bunty looked at Charlotte and persisted. Is that what happens to you and Emily, Claire? Emily usually answered all such questions, even those addressed to Charlotte. But still, she answered nothing at all. Everyone except Emily was looking at Charlotte now. She blushed and cleared her throat, and scratched at the desk with her fingernail. But the odd thing was that once she had started to speak, she knew it all so well that she might have been talking about Emily and herself, and not about Emily and Claire. We do stay with a lot of people, I suppose. Aunt Dolly likes having us, but she's ill sometimes, so we have to go away. But of course people don't really mind having us. It's very kind of them. Isn't it, Emily? Aunt Dolly always says. It was right after this that Charlotte began to dream she was fighting to stay as Charlotte, and one night woke from such a dream, struggling, even crying a little. When she was calm again, she did not feel sleepy at all, so she lay still, carefully and deliberately making herself remember Aviary Hall, object by object, room by room. Also, she made herself remember things that had happened to her as Charlotte, but it was alarming how the details seemed to slip away from her. Even when she tried to conjure up her sister Emma's face, she kept on seeing Emily's. Then she found herself thinking about Agnes's brother Arthur instead, about his room and all the things Miss Agnes had told her about him. She did not try to stop these thoughts because they seemed safe and comfortable, making a third and separate existence in which neither as Charlotte nor Claire she was involved. When she fell asleep again, she dreamed about Arthur, both the boy in the tinted photograph and the man with the big mustache. He climbed the monkey puzzle tree and banged his soldier's drum. He wore a soldier's uniform and sat in the muddy field, and then suddenly he was setting out his soldiers on the dining room table, and she sat beside him, watching him as if she were his sister Agnes too. And that is the end of chapter 12.